Hey guys, welcome back. We are on 5.4. This is impacts of agricultural practices, and this will largely be a continuation of the 5.3 notes we took, which were on the Green Revolution. So a lot of things that we'll touch on in this we've already sort of hinted at in those first set of notes. Our learning objectives for today are to describe agricultural practices that cause environmental problems, discuss the impacts of harmful agricultural practices, and discuss slash and burn agriculture. First, I want to use the term arable. Arable is just a term to describe land that is ready / able to grow crops. This is to then understand the term non-arable land, which means the land is not able or ready to grow crops. We generally use the term non-arable in response to some sort of human impact on the soil that has made it no longer capable of growing crops. And so some of the things we're going to talk about today, tilling, slash and burn, are practices that may contribute to this problem. So we're going to start with tilling. Tilling is, I actually used the term earlier, turning the soil over. It's a common practice that would happen right before seeds were planted or as we were getting fields ready for seeds to be planted. What you're seeing happening here is these really large sort of metal discs or wheels on this piece of machinery, something that's run by fossil fuels, coming in and turning the topsoil layer over. And what it's really doing is it's aerating the soil. So it's making room for one, seeds to be planted, and two, once those seeds starts to grow, it allows for the root system to be able to sort of dig itself in. Now there's a couple problems associated with this. Now you'll notice in the image that on the left-hand side, the soil is kind of more compact and the top is covered with some vegetation, like some light grasses and things like this. This is non-exposed soil. As soon as we begin tilling the soil, we have something called bare soil. Bare soil is highly susceptible to soil erosion, more specifically to wind erosion. It's no longer being protected by any type of vegetation, and you've now disrupted the normal layers, those OABC layers that we talked about in our soil unit. You've disrupted that natural layering that would normally occur. So as a result, we call it bare soil. It makes it more susceptible to soil erosion, which can contribute to intensified or increasing eutrophication. And it can also increase the need for more fertilizer, because if we have higher amounts of soil erosion off the top, some of those nutrients that were sitting on the top are going to run off and end up in nearby waterways, watersheds. So it may increase our need to add even more fertilizer, which can continue to run off additionally. And in doing this, we also release stored carbon. So we know carbon is stored in soil, but as we turn it over like this, we may be releasing stored carbon that was, normally meant to be a long-term storage. The next concept here is slash and burn agriculture. You may be familiar with this term because it's really commonly done in the Amazon rainforest, and it was a large contributor to some of the fires that were happening in the Amazon rainforest just a couple years back. So this technique doesn't just occur there. It typically occurs in developing countries, and even more specifically occurs in tropical rainforests or areas that have really low nutrient soils. And we know tropical rainforests tend to have very low nutrient soils because they have so much rainfall that many of the nutrients that are in that topsoil run off with it. So what happens in slash and burn is farmers that are normally subsistence farmers, and remember, subsistence farmers are just farmers that are growing food to sustain themselves or their families, a very small community, not necessarily for any type of economic gain, but just to sustain themselves. They will cut down trees within these tropical forests, burn the trees, and then use the ash from the trees as a fertilizer for the soil. And so ash is actually very nutrient rich. All of the nutrients that were once stored in the tree are now in this ash material. So things like potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, all those necessary macronutrients for growth in a plant. You can add those to this once nutrient poor soil of the tropical forest floor, and it basically allows you to start with this very kind of instant nutrient rich soil to start growing crops. Now in the Amazon, they are growing cash crops. So they're doing it in order to make more money. So instead of being subsistence farmers, they're using the land where all of the trees were cut down and the nutrients from those trees to then try to create more crops that can be sold for a profit. The problem with this is it's not sustainable. The nutrients from that ash that came from the trees won't last forever. They will eventually run out. So it doesn't actually contribute to making the soil more nutrient rich over time. We always talk about soil being on this geologic time scale, the formation of it. Remember, we discussed primary and secondary succession and how that takes place over thousands of years, like to get that really nice mature soil and reach like a climax type community. There is no quick way around that. Time and untouched soil is the only way to get that really mature, nutrient-rich soil. So just quickly adding ash to the top is just that. It's sort of a quick fix. So it's an unsustainable option that will only last a few years. So what you're seeing happen in the Amazon is that once those nutrients run out from the trees that they cut down and burned, they will just move on to the next plot of land, cut down more trees, burn more trees, restart with the nutrients once again. So this is not the full reason why the Amazon rainforest was burning. There are other reasons, but this was a contributor to it. Sometimes slash and burn is also used to grow things like grasses so that you can have livestock graze on that land, and then they'll use the livestock as an economic opportunity to sell instead of cash crops, but still sort of the same idea. Now, this idea of making land non-arable, and actually let me go back here. So the whole purpose in talking about slash and burn agriculture is basically you're overusing the land once again. Once that nutrients from the ash runs out and you've been growing crops in that soil for the last couple of years, you've now left yourself with a completely depleted soil. There's no nutrients left, and that land is no longer arable, and you're not going to see natural growth come back to that for many, many, many years. Now, I gave you an example happening in another country, but I think it's important to note that we actually did this to ourselves here in the United States, and the example that you're probably familiar with is the Dust Bowl, which took place for almost the entire decade of the 1930s. And so you guys probably are more familiar with history than I am, but what we see happening is the Homestead Act sort of coaxes pioneers westward by incentivizing farming opportunities in the Great Plains. So we're talking about westward expansion. Federal government is trying to get people to make their way over. And we also have this attitude of manifest destiny, where Americans during this time are sort of led to believe that it's their duty to expand to the west, and they're being handed this opportunity to come and populate the Great Plains. There's over 160 acres of public land that's promised during the Homestead Act, so it basically brings this very large influx of inexperienced farmers to the Great Plains. With the opportunity to basically own land and to cultivate crop and make money off that crop. But again, you've got a bunch of people who aren't necessarily farmers coming in. So once they get there, what they start doing is this very intensive wheat cultivation. There's this growing demand over in Europe for wheat because there is a low amount of it. So there's a high demand. So the people in the Great Plains start growing tons of it, and they're selling it. And it's growing really, really, really well. They are sort of confused by the weather in the Great Plains at this point. They're not familiar with it. They are experiencing rainfall, and at this point in time, they just think that is sort of the norm. But as you guys know, with the Great Plains, they really largely vary in the amount of rainfall that they get and the type of vegetation that normally grows there. So what's normally there is grassland. So the Great Plains are those really, really naturally abundant grasslands. But what's happening is these farmers that move there start eliminating all of the native grasses to make room for even more crop growth to try to make even more money. So what happens? They completely overplow the grasslands, which leads to very, very increasingly marginal lands that can't be reached by any type of irrigation system, because you can see based on the map sort of where we're located in the United States, not a ton of water source opportunities in this area. There is the Aguala Aquifer, which is an underground water storage, which was very quickly depleted. And so they're starting to a tiny bit to see the effects of the land start to become non-arable. But then what happens is the Great Depression begins, and so does this on and off period of drought. And so for the next decade, this portion of the United States experiences extreme drought conditions. And so all of these crops that they planted in these areas began to fail. And without any type of deep-rooted native grasses to hold the soil in place, the overused soil begins to blow away. So we start to see in this area very dry and very windy conditions, which is why it in turn is called the Dust Bowl, because all of the soil that was completely depleted was almost now down to a sand. And there's no grasses left, there's no vegetation that's natively growing there, there's nothing to hold everything in place. So you basically see this massive amount of erosion occurring. And in turn, you're getting these massive, massive dust storms. The dust storms are so bad that over 125 million acres were impacted. A lot of these were acres that had been cleared for farmland, and over 2.5 million people left the area, and they moved even further west to California for more economic opportunity. You've probably heard of them. I think they referred to them as Okies. This was one of the greatest migration movements in the United States. It was the largest group of people moving all at once. And when they moved to California, they were looking for more economic opportunity, and a lot of people from these areas ended up settling in the San Joaquin Valley because there was farming opportunities available there. Now, rainfall doesn't return back to this area until the end of the 1930s, so 1939, 1940. So regular rainfall does begin again. However, this area doesn't really largely recover until around 1950. So it takes, almost a decade and more for this area to sort of start to recover economically. And really, there are still issues in this area with land that is considered arable. Okay, I think that's it. Let me know if you have questions, and I will see you guys soon. Thanks.